introduction in English. One way for you to know that you are not an animal like other animals is if you get drenched in a thunderstorm and can't just shake off the wetness, but have to go home and change your clothes, which also, of course, has aesthetic implications in some respects. But I'm glad that I can be here now and introduce Giovanni Aloi. My focus is in literary studies, and I was all the more glad to be able or to be offered the chance to actually venture into the field of art and art history in preparation of this introduction now and read Giovanni's book, Art and Animal, because it's a very interesting book. I'm sure many of you have already read this book, but if you haven't, I highly recommend it. And I guess we will get a kind of a preview of that book, or sort of a preview of that book tonight in his lecture. Giovanni Aloi holds a position as lecturer in history of art and visual cultures, working for institutions as diverse as Queen Mary University, Sotheby's Institute of Art, a school that evolved, and I quote from their homepage, from a small connoisseurship program begun by Sotheby's auction house in 1969, and Tate Galleries. Working for these institutions forces him to approach art not only from the lofty heights of the academy, but also from the gritty grounds of the market and the gallery or museum. Or perhaps, I don't know, Giovanni, perhaps it was the other way around with you. Perhaps your understanding of art as a practice that straddles the spaces of the academy, the market, and the gallery kept you from actually devoting your full professional energy to just one of those spaces. Be that as it may, in his book Art and Animals that came out in 2012, is that correct?
Right at the end of 2011, yes.
Oh, okay. So I was almost right. So in that book, he certainly drew on his experiences as an academic, a gallery manager, a curator of film programs, an educator, and last but not least, as the founder and current editor-in-chief of Antennae, the Journal of Nature and Visual Culture. Now, what I understood from looking into his work is that Giovanni Aloi has a sustained interest not only in art and art history, particularly in contemporary art, but also in exploring the relationship between animals and humans, or should we say between the human and other animals. We humans relate to other animals in multiple ways, by hunting, fearing, ignoring, violating, killing, petting, admiring, eating them. The list can be continued and is as long as the lexicon of verbs in any given language. The verbs that best describe the human-animal relationship Giovanni is most interested in include preserving, classifying, looking, painting, photographing, showcasing. In short, they represent activities that we have come to understand as either science or art. And what is also interesting in his book, what becomes clear reading his book, that the boundaries between these two spheres, science or these two discourses, science and art, become very, very permeable when he discusses the work he looks at. Aloi is particularly interested in contemporary art. One of the things that reading his book suggested to me is that art can be understood as a mode through which humans extrapolate other animals from their natural contexts and reinvent or reposition them as cultural artifacts, an exercise curiously resembling the process of civilization, our own process, basically. Is art simply mimicking that process? And if so, what does that say about modern civilization? Does art as metaphorical taxidermy participate in the practice of turning live animal subjects into spectacularly dead objects on display? Of course, we all know that if that were the case, if art did just that and nothing else, the dead animal would be doomed to be mere kitsch. Think of the deer head mounted on the wall of the hunter's lodge. But if the animal in art transcends the tacky, the kitschy, what exactly is the work it does? What is the knowledge that the animal in art produces? What knowledge about animality or the relationship between animality and humanity? Is there really a difference between the stuffed animal in a 19th century diorama and Damien Hirst's shark and formaldehyde? In other words, what are the epistemological and political questions raised by the animal in art? What are the ethical and aesthetic concerns? These are only a few of the questions underlying Aloi's project in Art and Animals, and I'm sure he will address some of them in his lecture today. And if he doesn't, I will make sure that we ask him those questions and find out what his answers to those questions are. I'm very glad you are here. Please join me in welcoming Giovanni Aloi.
Thank you, very kind. I'm really happy to be here, and of course, it's great that the slot I've been given has I have more time than the average conference, which is definitely useful in this case. So as I said, lots of questions. I'm looking forward to a very animated discussion later on, and I deliberately designed this talk in a quite provocative way. I think it's a good opportunity to talk amongst colleagues and exchange views in person, so make the most of the opportunity rather than keep you more strictly up to speed with my current research. So, first of all, I'd like to start from explaining the title of my talk, which is Animal Studies and Art, Elephants in the Room. We're all familiar with this figure of speech in which the elephant symbolizes an issue that everyone is aware of, but that nobody is openly addressing. And I'm sure within the different disciplines in animal studies, you're all familiar with the ones that obstruct your way more often at conferences. So in this talk, I will point out that there are perhaps far too many elephants in the room of animal studies and contemporary art. Perhaps too many to continue ignoring them, and too many to allow a productive discussion of contemporary art to continue in such room. So the purpose of this talk is that to usher out some of these elephants into the open. I have begun to spot some of these elephants over 15 years ago, over conferencing, publishing, and working with colleagues in the field of animal studies. And I have also learned that although elephants are admirable creatures indeed, the ones that belong to the species of this figure of speech seems to prevent us from advancing discussion about humans and animals by taking up valuable space. It is important that we continue to push things further in animal studies discussion, and that we at all costs avoid circularities that produce stagnation of ideas and hamper the potentialities of multidisciplinarity. Failing to move further means to waste the opportunity to capitalize on the real potential which contemporary art can bring to a productive rethinking of human-animal relations. So through this talk, I will spot some elephants, and I invite you to take note of them so that we can discuss them during the Q&A that will follow this talk. The talk is structured in two sections. The first focuses on the key ethical problematics in relation to the materiality of art, making art, and thinking, writing about art. It will explore the inherent challenges, contradictions, and paradoxes that artists and art historians alike have to face working in this field. The second part focuses on contemporary art and the challenges it faces along with the productivities it bears within the field of animal studies itself. So the first point I wish to make, more specifically, is related to the publication output and conferencing in animal studies, of course in relation to contemporary art. It perhaps constitutes the most conspicuous elephant in the room, the one I have named accusation. Those of you who have followed the events which have characterized the past 20 years of contemporary art, as critiqued and discussed from an animal studies lens, have probably noticed a recurrent, predominantly negative approach. This approach is the tendency to write papers denouncing a lack of ethicality in the treatment of animals in contemporary art. By no stretch of the imagination, I'm here implying that this may constitute an example of bad practice. This is not at all the case, but at the same time, I'm concerned that the productivities at stake in this approach might be, after all, limited. As we know, an animal rights-focused approach to art has been extremely valuable in preventing animal cruelty to take place in the gallery space. And I am deliberately not listing here the conspicuous number of occasions in which the intercession of animal rights groups have been essential to prevent animal cruelty and animal death from taking place in the name of art. Yet the continuous pointing out of the actual or presumed inappropriateness of animal treatment in art should not be considered to be the main or sole responsibility of an animal studies critique of art. Over the past few years, I have noticed a tendency from certain animal studies groups to exclusively focus on these negative instances, as if they understood animal studies as predominantly constituting a sort of policing activity. Spotting the mistreated animal or denouncing the alleged mistreatment of animals in art should be understood as one of the potentialities of animal studies within the artistic remit, not the only one. The second point I wish to make is also related to the publication output and conferencing in animal studies and art, and it revolves around the use of inappropriate examples or old examples to articulate generalistic cases against contemporary art, which cannot be considered academically valid or representative of broader realities when discussing a field as complex as contemporary art itself. So what do I mean by this? Well, I've come across a number of lectures and a number of essays over the past 7 to 8 years at least that keep going back to works of art that were made 20 years ago and pointing out the inappropriateness of treatment of animals in those works of art. That's all very well, as I have explained in this section, but I'm wondering what the productivities at stake might be in going back all the time to artworks that we know treated animals in certain ways. Isn't it more important, perhaps, to measure the impact of what we've done over the past 10 years, discussing art and the treatment of animals in art, and address more recent works of art, so to be able to appreciate better what this impact might be? The second recurrent use of old examples I find particularly annoying, and I want to be pretty honest about it. I've come across quite a few papers and lectures at conferences in which some lecturers use the works of art of BA students, so degree undergraduate students, to illustrate a case against animals in art. And I'm sure we've all come across the example of an undergraduate student who's been killing a cat and filming it to present it as a work of art for their graduation show. There's another case that keeps coming back of a chicken that's been skinned alive. Now, these are definitely very regrettable events, but to equate these events to examples of contemporary art is quite problematic. Just to understand better what I'm trying to get to here is just imagine a literature scholar who wants to illustrate the current state of affairs of animals in literature, let's say in British literature, and chooses to use the work of an undergraduate student, a text that they've written, as an example of the situation with representation in literature. embryish novels. That would be absolutely odd to use as an example. Yet again, it has happened in contemporary art, and it keeps happening. I read an essay that was using the examples I told you about of the skinned cat and the chicken just about a month ago. So my idea here is, let's move on, right? And let's choose our examples a little bit more carefully when it comes to contemporary art, and let's try to break things down a little bit more. So this leads me to the last preliminary point I wish to make with regards to writing and thinking attitudes in animals and contemporary art, by posing a substantial question. A question that's related to responsibility. Sure, it's a question as well that you've heard about substantially over the past 10 years. For the purpose of illustrating this point, I like to use Damien Hirst as example. So I'm going to be a little, put on the table a little provocation here. Damien Hirst is also very provocative when it comes to animal studies, but I find very rarely addressed competently at that. So far too much has been perhaps said about the artist's use of a dozen cows in his work from the 1990s. Meanwhile, 32,500,000 cows were slaughtered in the US alone in 2013. 90,277 were killed every day last year, and 3,671 will be dead by the time I'm done with my talk. So my question is, if one's priority in animal studies becomes that of denouncing the killing or ethical mistreatment of animals in the world, why focus on 6 dead cows in the gallery space instead of doing or saying something more specific with regards to the millions dying every year? I know that some scholars in animal studies are particularly sensitive to issues of representation, and I do not mean to diminish the importance which representation plays in culture. I'm an art historian. Yet, if I deemed my mission in animal studies to be that of reducing animal killing and ethical mistreatment, I would perhaps choose my target more carefully. To simply read Hirst's use of cows as disrespectful and gratuitous display of animal death means to entirely miss the point of what these works tell us about our transhistorical relationships with animals. Our desire to know how animal metabolisms work, our desire to map ours against theirs, and to marvel at the differences and similarities we encounter. It reminds us that the medicines we'll all take to overcome deadly diseases do indeed come from animal sacrifices. To reduce these works to hollow spectacles, entertainment, or freak shows is to miss the point which we all have to face, that ultimately the production of knowledge, and I mean knowledge that may eventually save human and animal lives alike, relies upon acts of controlled violence. It is this inescapable contradiction embedded in epistemology, in the history of knowledge and human culture, that Hirst so well illustrates with his work. And it is this inert contradiction which makes everyday life what it is, that we cannot ignore and that we should not deny. Contemporary art, as I will discuss at length later on, meddles with the contradictions and paradoxes which make life what it is. It no longer constructs a perfect and unattainable world of harmony, like in the case of classical art. So I would like to now focus this discussion on pointing out 3 elephants in the room. These elephants are all related. Leading these elephants out of the room and into the open will enable us to better understand why being an artist or an art historian working with animals in art is not a simple task, as some may think. The identification of these elephants in the room will show that art, making art, and discussing art is entangled in a series of paradoxes and inherent contradictions which ultimately require the consideration of a very careful ethicality to be crafted in order to fairly discuss old and new art alike. This ethicality, I argue in this talk, may not necessarily match the ethical parameters of animal rights activism or veganism. Yet, this does not mean that these theoretical frameworks should be perceived as incompatible. However, it is also particularly important to recognize these incompatibilities. And I say that because I believe that avoiding this confrontation between frameworks will induce circularities of arguments, meaning that we will not progress further in our discussion of animals in art. And that does bother me quite a bit. So here's the three elephants in the room that I want to address all at once. First of all, animal visibility. I will tell you what I mean exactly by this in a minute. Then art materials. And the third elephant effectively is related to the other two. It's responsibility. And it's the one that decides whether we care or whether we don't. So starting from animal visibility, there's something very important that we need to address, and I'm sure many of us are familiar with some of the works I'm going to show you. I'm going back in time deliberately here. I know I told you that it's important to use new examples, but I wanted to go back to this because in a way, The Shark by Damien Hirst is the big catalyst in terms of bringing the animal body into the gallery space in a way that was deemed to be utterly problematic. You can't ignore that animal body. How many of you have seen a piece by Damien Hirst or by another artist involving an animal in a preserved state? Seen in a gallery, museum, quite a few of you? It's a shocking experience, isn't it, somehow? Somehow it does something more or different than encountering these bodies in a natural history museum where we expect them to be. And of course the staging of this is slightly different from what a natural history museum would be doing. But the dead animal body within a scientific setting, it's only one of the many manifestations of animals in art that have taken place over the past 20 years. The other problematic visibility of animals in the gallery space is perhaps constituted by taxidermy. Now, would anyone say here in this room that they love taxidermy? Nobody dares. I know there's somebody out there being quiet, very quiet. So, as you probably know, taxidermy has become everything and the opposite of everything. You're very likely to encounter a piece of taxidermy in a museum of contemporary art or in a gallery, but natural history museums have become very wary of what they do with taxidermy, and I'm going to go back to taxidermy later on in this talk. But of course, this is also a good example of animal visibility in the gallery space. I think when I say animal visibility in the gallery space, what I really mean is the animal body that's been manipulated to a degree, but not so much that it loses its shape to a degree. And of course, the very controversial use of live animals in the gallery space. I'm sure you've all read about many examples. This is actually one of those that's not been talked about almost at all in the history of animal studies and art. And of course, the questions raised here are pretty straightforward. Should an animal ever be in a gallery? Galleries are not designed to constitute the environment, a good living environment for animals. This doesn't mean that they necessarily cannot be, but there have been questions also raised with regards to whether an animal, a live animal in a gallery space, could ever be considered a collaborator in art, or whether that's just an impossible attainment. And of course, the most controversial of all, it's the killing of animals in the gallery space, which is indeed problematic, yet has happened for a very long time. And this last example, perhaps the most shocking of them all, leads me on to the next elephant in the room, which is art materials. In this last case, most specifically, when the animal is killed in a gallery space, there's almost an assumption by artists and public alike that the animal is being turned into art materials and loses its bodily shape entirely. So why am I looking at art materials? Well, because I think up until now, art materials have not been discussed almost at all in animal studies and art, and they've actually very rarely been discussed in art history more in general. So art materials constitute a kind of double elephant. It's a pretty big elephant that stretches across animal studies and contemporary art, but history of art itself. So some very influential art historians like James Elkins has more recently admitted himself that there is a major gap in the study of history of art in relation to art materials and what art materials may mean in the making of art. Is it just the vehicle through which we make an art object, or is there more to discuss? And of course, when it comes to animal studies and art, I think we have a responsibility to discuss something that's not been discussed. So here I am getting this other elephant out of the room and in the open. So for instance, I'm showing you here what's considered to be a classical masterpiece. And one of the things that I have to point out is that classical art does not get bad press in animal studies. So it's usually received quite well. There are a number of explanations to this that I'm going to go through with you today. But for instance, in the case of a painting such as this, where you can clearly see an objectification of the female form, I'm quite sure, there is a strange paradox at stake. So, like in gender studies, most of the critique about the representation of animals in classical painting has revolved around representation. So, you might have come across animal studies scholars discussing representation of animals in classical art. And that's totally fine. Yet, when it comes to focusing on animals, it is also important to consider the animal deaths which contributed to the making of the painting themselves. These cannot be ignored, and the new and renewed attention to materiality when animals are involved is becoming more and more prominent in animal studies. So, my desire is to bring these two notions of representation and animal materiality together, because this is happening in other fields. Yet again, contemporary art and history of art is lagging behind just a little bit. So all these classical paintings that we are pretty familiar with, some of which present you with animals, some of which do not present you with animals, as I will show you today, have a lot to do with animals, even the ones that seem to be more innocent than others. So, I don't know, many of you have had a chance to read this pretty amazing book, but Animal Capital by Nicole Shukin does something quite important that can be transposed to many other disciplines and definitely to art more in general. So, in Nicole Shukin's groundbreaking book, Animal Capital, the author argues in favor of the recovery of material histories of economic and symbolic powers in cultural discourses. The concept of animal capital, central to the book, constitutes a resolutely materialist engagement, quoting from the author, with the question of the animal. So not just a question of representation anymore, but a question of materiality embedded in representation itself. The concept enables us to equally consider the cultural and carnal rendering of animals in representation. This is how Nicole Shukin uses the terms. It's carnal, meaning that animal bodies, flesh, has gone into the making of representation itself. So, Animal Capital therefore brings together in discussion what has generally been ignored by critics and historians, that animal representation is intrinsically related to the carnal consumption or assimilation of animal matter. Materialist critique, the author argues, has been sidestepped by philosophical inquiry. It is at this stage that we encounter what constitutes the most prominent paradox of animal studies, the dichotomy between materiality and pure theorization and the possibility or impossibility to productively interlink the two. It is indeed this dichotomy that provokes much of the friction between different groups in animal studies, and it is this polarity that needs to be more carefully addressed for the purpose of producing a more balanced view on animal relations, human-animal relations at that. In Animal Capital, Shukin adopts the term rendering to connote the dual level of consumption which characterizes certain instances of animal capital. The rendering means therefore to represent something. So drawing an animal is a form of rendering, so you're rendering the shape of the animal. But at the same time, rendering means boiling down, turning the animal body into ingredients, into materials that go into the making of an object. Rendering, therefore, makes it possible to think about human-animal relations in terms of biopolitics of representation, providing an alternative to the purely aesthetic analysis of representation itself. By this I mean that we no longer should stop at the picture and discuss what the picture shows, which is fine in many gender analysis of female or male objectification, so the analysis of the paradigm which places the body in the position of objectification. But when it comes to animal, we have to acknowledge, if we are so keen to point out animal death and animal cruelty in the gallery, that animal meta goes into the work of art itself through the process of rendering. So I want to take a closer look at what animals go into the making of classical art. And this is partly to balance out the picture between contemporary art and the negative press contemporary art constantly gets for the use of animals, and what classical art never receives as criticism. So, starting from insects, I'm sure some of you knew that there were insects in classical paintings. Did you know that? Good, some of you do. Commerce with the Americas and India led to the introduction of new red pigments derived from insects. And one of them is the Coctus cacti, which was dried and crushed. This is what it looks like. It's a scale insect. It's considered to be a parasite. And as you know, in animal studies, when it comes to parasites, a lot has been said about their important role in society and more general in culture, but yet again we have a very conflictual relationship with parasites. Too many of them will kill the plants. We need the plants to survive because we need to feed upon them. We don't like them. We kill them. And that's not the only one. So Kermes vermilia was also used in the same way. Again, it's another parasite. As you can see, it doesn't look particularly exciting to us, so the death of the scale insect doesn't really matter in culture more broadly. Caryolaca was used to produce a hue of red too. Caryolaca is a little bit more complex than the other scale insects I showed you. But if you're familiar with scale insects, they don't do much. Scale insects just stay on the plant as a scale. That's why they're called scale. And you probably have by now worked out that even in animal studies, there is a tendency to favor those animals that do a lot, that return the gaze, that kind of pay us back, right? There's an investment that it's returned. I guess I could safely bet nobody has a scale insect as a pet. Exactly. You might want to try, right? Mollusks. Of course, it's not just insects that we find going into classical painting. Other pigments like Tyrian purple were derived from the murex snail, and I'm sure you're all familiar with the murex snail because it's one of the most pretty snails that have been circulated as souvenirs over the past 50 to 80 years, since going to the beach means much more than just bathing, but you have to bring something back home. These are the shells that everyone at some point, not so much in fashion right now everywhere, but at some point really big, you can just buy bags of them, then you put them in your bathroom, right? Water association, they go very well there. So why shells? Well, the reason why I'm interested in the use of these shells is that the color is prepared from a small cyst within the shell, and huge quantities were required, and small heaps of the shells can still be seen on the sites of ancient dye works around the Mediterranean. In 1908, Friedlander collected just 1.4 grams of pure dye from 12,000 mollusks. This comes from the Winsor & Newton site, and you probably are familiar with Winsor & Newton. They're one of the leading companies in the world to produce pigments for artists. So it's fascinating that 12,000 mollusks to get 1.4 grams of dye. Can you visualize it in your head? Is that a little bit scary? Not sure. Do you care for mollusks? I hope you do. It is very scary to me, so we'll go back over this point of the impact, the ecological impact. Think about 12,000 mollusks taken out of an area to create 1.4 grams of dye, right? What do you think happens to the sea in there in the sea where these mollusks have been taken out? Eggs. Before oil paint was introduced in Northern Europe during the 15th century, artists predominantly used eggs to gel tempera pigments together. And it's just, if you like, part of the practice. That's what artists had to do to match the standards that were imposed upon them by the markets. You know, like you heard in my introduction, my background goes beyond traditional history of art. I'm interested in art markets throughout the history of art, and it is impossible for me to just look at a painting and not think about all the networks and ramifications that got the painting or the work of art itself to be there in the first place. And if you don't care about mollusks, you might care about rabbits, right? Oh, cute they are, right? There you go. They are cute, but rabbits, once they go into classical painting, they're no longer cute because they were turned into skin glue, so used in Renaissance art as a sizing agent to prepare the canvas to receive oil paint. So it's a primer agent. You basically get your canvas stretched, and then you prime it all with rabbit glue. Looks like this. This is what the rabbit ends up looking like. As you can see, it's not as cute anymore. And other mammals, of course. We've been thinking about the object itself, so the painting, but you have to think about what makes the painting itself, not just the paint. So you've got brushes. Hair and bristles of horses, boars, rabbits, hogs, oxen, squirrels, goats, and badgers could be used to make a large variety of paint brushes available in different shapes and degrees of softness. And as I'm sure you're all guessing, it wasn't a matter of sitting the animal down and saying, hey, I'm going to give you a shave and I'm going to make brushes, right? It was a matter of killing them, removing the whole skin, then creating the brushes, right? So I understand some of you are thinking, where are you going with this? Well, I'm about to tell you. Consideration here. A beautiful Renaissance painting can contain hundreds of dead insects, mollusks, and mammals. However, these have all been processed and rendered invisible. Remember, my initial point was about animal visibility. We respond to animal visibility in contemporary art. You see a shark, you see a parrot. It's the killing of an animal. But then we have to really wonder, okay, we've got one shark over there, and any classical painting can literally contain hundreds and hundreds of dead animals that have all been processed. That's a rendering, right, that Nicole Schuken is using in Animal Capital, and that have gone into the making of the painting. We don't see those bodies anymore. But does that mean we don't care? Does that mean that because those animals are no longer visible, then the death hasn't happened? And I know what you're thinking. I know some of you are probably already working out a response to this. But we have to go back to taxidermy in order to address these properly first. So, what I'm trying to do here will probably annoy some people. But I have said to you before that taxidermy has become really controversial when it comes to natural history museums and, of course, when it comes to galleries. Yet again, I have tried to get us to think about animal death right now. A taxidermy animal is a dead animal body that we can see. The skin proves that the animal was killed. And again, here, all the animals have just disappeared in these beautiful images. I'm sure that whenever we all walk through classical art museums, National Gallery in London, the Louvre in Paris, we're all bombarded by this beauty. It's impossible to resist, isn't it? But think about walking through these places and think, 200 rabbits dead, 3,000 mollusks dead over there. We wouldn't quite carry the same sort of lyrical approach. All these beautiful classical paintings we see are basically animal graveyards, right? And whether we like it or not, that's pretty much what it is. So the question is, we react very strongly to this right now, where you can actually identify a pigeon or a shark or a tiger or a bear, but nobody's ever had any issues with this, which we know contain a lot of animal deaths. And I just want to make sure that I'm not passing myself as the pioneer of art materials in classical art, right? I haven't dissected paintings to find out what it is in them. Everyone knows what's in them. Nobody has really raised any issue with that. So, it is at this stage worth advancing questions of relativity between two very distinct categories of objects that, from a materialist point of view, may now appear to share much more analogies than previously thought. Taxidermy has over the past 15 years become particularly problematic in museum settings. As Rachel Polquin has extensively demonstrated, the moral commitments, quoting, of animal rights have played a substantial role in the removal of taxidermy from museum displays. Some collections have been discarded and destroyed, whilst others have been put in permanent storage. Animal rights and vegan agendas take issue with taxidermy, for it effectively constitutes the killing of animals. The visibility of animal skin functions as the undeniable proof of such killing, and simultaneously taxidermy has come to embody the patriarchal values of subjugation which have characterized the history of humankind. Most especially, taxidermy dating back to the 19th century is directly related to the devastation and subjugation of otherness perpetrated by imperialism. As such, animal deaths, which took place over 150 years ago, do matter indeed to many scholar circles. However, why would we draw a line at acknowledging the multiple animal deaths which went into a single Renaissance painting 600 years ago? And of course I say Renaissance, but from the 1400s all the way up to Impressionism, animal materials went into painting without a second thought, and they still do today. I'm just not really focusing on painting today, but if you think that everything out there is acrylic, wrong. There's still plenty of animals hiding in today's paintings. So why would we decide to ignore the fact that classical painting constituted an almost exclusively patriarchal tool for the writing and rewriting of man's power over women and the other more in general? Is it enough for us to deny animal death as long as the animal bodies in question are no longer visible to the naked eye? A few months ago, I was discussing this issue with an art historian working in animal rights who has only recently joined animal studies. His objection to my argument was that Renaissance artists, quote, did not have a choice. I am afraid that this excuse has been persistently used for the very purpose of denying the importance of animal death when convenient. Artists' pigments were back then, in the Renaissance, derived from minerals and vegetable matter alike, as well as from animal bodies. If artists had seriously considered animal death intolerable, including those like Leonardo, who seemed to be very compassionate to animals, they would have researched ways to develop pigment production without involving the killing of any animal. This would have been entirely possible. The choice of killing or not killing animals has always been with us, and it is very visible in the choice artists made of not wanting to kill pets for the purpose of making pigments. They indeed had a choice. The other choice would have been never to paint again. I always find it fascinating that whenever the argument of they didn't have a choice is raised, nobody is considering that if you really felt for the killing of animals back in the 1500s, and being an artist imposed on you the killing of animals, that was an option not to be an artist. You could have found another job. But guess what? You probably remember what it was like in the 1500s, right? It wasn't nice not to be in the court. It was not nice not to be loved and cared for by a patron who paid everything for you, right? And made you feel safe, made you feel important and successful. So it is very likely that working in hyper-competitive fields like those in the days, classical artists decided, because of money and because of power, to choose to kill animals to make art for their work, in order to meet the high standards imposed by the system. Just perhaps as much as Damien Hirst is doing today. Yet I am not aware of an animal studies argument which denounces the use of animals in classical painting. A serious ethical approach to animal killing in art, I argue, cannot deny the killing of animals which happened in the past. Likewise, it is also important to remember that animal death systematically occurs in the making of some of the most celebrated production of illustration in natural history, before the invention of photography. So if you're familiar with the many beautiful illustrations by Audubon or the beautiful illustrations of butterflies with Maria Sibylla Merian, you might also be aware of the fact that for the purpose of producing these illustrations, multiple animals have to die. These are pre-photographic illustrations. There is documentation from these artists that explain how they killed multiple insects and multiple birds and set them to the pose they wanted before they started painting them. So whenever we look at one of these illustrations, we marvel at how beautiful they are, but I haven't heard anybody raising issue with the fact that technically this can only happen if animals die for the purpose of posing for the artist. Then it's up to us ethically whether we care about these deaths that have been made invisible. Once again, I'm going back to the point of visibility and invisibility here. And when it comes to this, I just wanted to quickly point out the work of this very interesting Danish artist called Christine Maidstone, who created a work in which she follows the journey of a pig from slaughter all the way into a chain of consumption. So the work itself, she says it's a catalog, if you like. It's a book that you see here. And it contains, that's the name of the pig that she traced around the world after it became an ingredient for the world in which we live in. And she traces this pig from cuts of meat, which is the most readily obvious use of pigs that you can imagine, all the way into objects that we thought perhaps would not include pig derivatives. For instance, here in this little statuette, the pig goes into the sheen that you see around it. You probably buy one of these and never assume that there's pig in it, but there is. And there's also some pig in pudding. There's pig in jewelry, right? If you're given a nice necklace, but you might be given a piece of pig. And there's also pig in crayons, right? And I mean, you can take a look at the whole catalog. It's that the catalog is the work of art itself. There's pig pretty much anywhere. She goes into showing us how there's pig on the concrete that we walk on the street, how there's pig in anything that it's pretty much fat-free on the market. But, you know, you can look up her website and get more of an idea of what she's trying to say with it, and the idea, again, of responsibility. That's the last elephant for this section that I wanted to usher out of the room. And in order to do so, I want to go back to Damien Hirst and a work of art that it's a little bit more recent than the shark. I don't know if you had the pleasure to see these beautiful paintings, let's call them, made of butterfly wings. Nobody's seen them in the flesh? Now, they do something pretty special. If you see them, I've worked at Tate for quite some times, and I worked at Tate during the Damien Hirst retrospective that took place almost 2 years ago now. Now, I've taken quite a few people in the room where these paintings were hanged, and there's something fascinating that happens. Not many people realized upon entering the room that that was actually what it was, that, you know, the paintings were made with butterfly wings. They thought they were painted. Then when they get closer, usually they realize what's going on. And do you think people are horrified by it? Most people didn't flinch. Right? I was there waiting. Let me see you flinch. Let me see you react to this. Most people just go like, oh, it's butterflies. Yeah, it's butterflies. Can you count how many went into the making of this? It got all very paradoxical as well, because there was let's call it painting again, but there was a piece by Damien Hirst right opposite, made with flies. Right? It's a black hole covered in flies. Nobody cared about those deaths. I kill them all, whatever. With butterflies, people loved it, right? Even stranger, if you like, than killing flies. And I became interested in trying to understand more about these paintings. I actually wrote a paper about these paintings, and it's called On a Wing and a Prayer, where I discuss more about why we're fascinated by these objects in the knowledge that they cause so much killing. And I went beyond the object itself. This is, I think, the big argument today, to try to move beyond the appearance and try to understand contemporary art as a network of inferences and actions that are equally as important as the representation itself. So, that sounds odd, right? But you can imagine why. You know, Damien Hirst's market has been alive and kicking, not so much now, but around the time he became the biggest UK importer of tropical butterflies, it definitely was very healthy. And what is interesting about this statement? Well, I researched something about what's going on with butterflies around the world. So believe it or not, there's a trade of butterflies, tropical butterflies of course, worth $100 million out there. Does anyone collect butterflies? No. And nobody likes taxidermy either. Now, I know it's not very common to collect butterflies anymore, but believe it or not, there's a very healthy business out there. That's where the $100 million come from. And that was a problem a few years ago. Think about 30 to 40, 50 years ago. This has been going on since the Victorian period in which everyone went butterfly crazy. Out there are people who paid £10,000 or more for a beautifully preserved and intact specimen of some tropical butterflies. So the tropical butterfly trade, as in the regulated trade, has been proved to provide effective tropical forest protection by generating monitored and regulated income for rural economies that in the past have harvested wild species, bringing them to near extinction and devastating ecosystems. I'm pretty sure you're familiar with butterfly farms. You probably all know that you can go online and buy a butterfly. Has anyone done that? No. They're roughly, £1.50 to £10, £20. What you get placing your order is a chrysalis. Right? You can get a chrysalis and then you hatch it and then you kill it for the purpose of building up your collection. Yes, there are people out there doing just that. Now, opening butterfly farms in places like Thailand, the tropics more in general, has actually had a very important impact on ecosystems. It stops poachers from killing the wild butterflies and collecting them because it changes the rules of the market. I think it's interesting to think about the ethical question. Which is the real issue and which poses the real threat to ecosystems and wild animals? What do we care about? The deaths of all the butterflies that were farmed for the making of Damien Hirst's paintings? Or do we care about the fact that somehow Damien Hirst's paintings and the way he procures the butterflies support a system that prevents the wild ones from being killed to the level they would be? The objects that I've become really concerned with during this research were not Damien Hirst butterfly paintings anymore, but these trays. Does anyone own one of these trays? No, good, that's a good one. Because they're quite disturbing. Now, most of these trays, which are produced as souvenirs today, they've been produced all along since the 40s and 50s, but these are produced mostly through the irregulated butterfly trade, meaning that all that you see here is going from tropical butterflies that have been caught illegally, right? If you ask me whether I'm more disappointed or upset about animal death of this kind and this kind, I have to tell you, this is the one that really annoys me. This annoys me in a different way. But I care a lot about the ramifications that eventually impact ecosystems in opposition to the pointing at the individual animals that might die in the gallery space. So, moving on to the second half, a look at contemporary art and animal studies more specifically. So in this final section, I wish to reiterate why contemporary art constitutes an important tool in the rethinking of human-animal relations, as I am under the impression that its relevance may be at present being discounted by some. For this purpose, I also consider it essential to identify some of the prominent traits of contemporary art more broadly. For instance, contemporary art poses questions, in opposition to classical art, which only had answers, right? Love is beautiful. In contemporary art, love is what is love, right? Poses questions. Contemporary art proposes no answers and no truths. If you're keen on contemporary art, you know that going to a contemporary gallery, it's usually kind of unsettling experience. You will be surprised by what you see and surprised by what you think of what you've seen when you come out of the gallery. That's what good contemporary art does to you. Contemporary art is not interested in beautiful and affirmative aesthetic experiences anymore. I'm sure you've all noticed that. That's of course because beauty is now being discounted as something that stops our thinking to the surface. And contemporary art enables individuals to make up their own minds about experiences. I'm sure you can focus on these points and see at a glance why looking at animals through a contemporary art lens can be very productive to animal studies itself. Contemporary art will deliberately make you feel uncomfortable for the purpose of rethinking your certainties. Now, this trait of contemporary art, which I think, I have the impression, when you lecture, give a paper at a conference in animal studies, I'm sure one of the challenges that you've all experienced is the multidisciplinarity of animal studies. I'm going to talk about this right at the very end more readily, but the idea that I'm here talking to you about history of art and contemporary art. I started to study history of art when I was 10. How can I expect that lecturers in English, geography, philosophy, and other subjects know the crannies and inside outs of contemporary art like art historians do? Yet again, I'm trying to convey what the main points are in a very limited time, right? This is what causes most of the, I think, incomprehension and difficulties in animal studies. When it comes to contemporary art being nasty, contemporary art not wanting you to indulge in beauty and indulge in truth, you can trace it all back to the beginning of modern art. Amazing painting by Manet called Olympia. It's a painting that Manet designed because he was annoyed. He wanted to get some elephants out of the room in the Parisian society of that time. The painting that caused this was this. The Venus, the Birth of Venus by Alexander Cabanel, which I call the post-orgasmic Venus. You can see how she's the epitome of that beauty, right? Look at her body. It looks like tomato porcelain, and she's totally vulnerable for your eyes. She's exposed as an object. You can consume her the way you want, and of course that's exactly what happened. It won the first prize at the Salon of 1863, and Napoleon III purchased it right away for himself. So this painting received 2 major stamps of approval at that time in that society as the best example of painting at the time. So Manet went like, well, you know what, let me give you this to think about. And this is exactly the strength of this painting. It makes you think about something that it's not post-orgasmic fantasies or pre-orgasmic fantasies. It makes you think about the difference between this naked woman and this naked woman. Right? This is a Venus. By looking at it, you elevate yourself. You think about classical love. There's nothing purest than classical love. But who's this? A prostitute. This is the first prostitute in the history of art. Olympia is a fictional character that Manet painted, and if you were a French man living in 1863, confronted by this painting, you would have known like that this is a prostitute because of what she wears here and there, because of the flowers in the hair. To us today, these references have kind of diminished in potency. She's annoying to the average, well, I say average, but I should really say upper-class aristocratic man of 1863, because prostitutes at this time are to be had but not to be seen, right? It's another problem of visibility. Everyone was going after prostitutes at the time, but nobody could admit to it, and nobody would want to be seen going with them. Yet Olympia is a powerful prostitute. She's not on the street, she receives her clients in a studio. And she has a servant. The servant offers her flowers. She's so good at what she does. She gets presents. This is the annoying thing. That a woman at the time could mingle with high society, with politicians, by being a prostitute. Low strata of society, mingling with the top of society, really annoying to society structure of the time. And of course, issues of representation. Naked body, why this arouses people and this upsets people. So as we know, people who went to the Salon in 1864, they laughed at this painting. They nervously laughed at this painting because they had questions in their heads that they couldn't answer right away. Questions about gender representation, questions about why do I feel uncomfortable, and questions about race and social structure that they couldn't quite compute right away. This is sort of everything is going into a short circuit for art. So the beginning of modern art has been treasured by contemporary art. Contemporary art really capitalizes on this idea that you need to think, you need to rethink what you thought was true. So contemporary art will deliberately make you feel uncomfortable, as we said, and constitutes therefore an opportunity to rethink human-animal relationships outside the limiting boundaries of discipline-specific methodologies. And I'm sure that this is what we've all experienced as scholars in animal studies. We need to think about animals and us outside the box that our discipline puts us in. That's why I love to go to conferences and hear from a geography scholar or a philosophy scholar or a historian, because I cannot quite get there. But I can borrow something from them and make it my own. It won't be as if I had studied history per se since I was 10, but it'd be something more than if I hadn't heard anything at all. So, where am I going with this? Contemporary art is interested in understanding otherness, not sameness. Well, this is where I become a little annoying, but I need to. I'm, devoted to this idea that this is about getting the elephants out of the room. Well, let's get them all out. So, what is the idea of otherness and the idea of sameness in this case? The concept of otherness has become central to cultural discussions since the 1970s. And I'm sure you're very familiar with your own disciplinary concept of otherness. It is, however, only more recently, with animal studies, that the ultimate otherness of animals has started to broaden and problematize such concept. Generally speaking, contemporary art's invitation to consider otherness is paramount. Contemporary art challenges us to stretch our horizons. It invites us to consider what we have not acknowledged yet, and challenges to develop a relational approach with that which substantially differs from us. In contemporary art, we are invited to embrace otherness for the very reason that the other is not like us, for the very reason that we are substantially different from each other, and that there is wealth and beauty in that difference. This difference, if you like, can be considered in similar ways to biodiversity in the natural world. However, animal rights philosophy is founded on the opposite dynamic. Animals should be granted rights on the grounds of their likeness to us. It is our ability to recognize human quality in animals and an ability which simultaneously constitutes an inability to see beyond anthropomorphism that rights should be granted to animals. It is here that we also encounter the main issue with animal rights and those animals who do not lend themselves to straightforward anthropomorphism, such as insects, amphibians, fish, reptiles, and so on. Do they have any rights? It is at the crux of the clash between these two essential relations to otherness that most of the dialogue between contemporary art and animal rights falls flat and cannot productively advance. And I believe it is worth to call this elephant out in the open now, instead of relentlessly witness the same discussional dead ends being repeated at conferences over and over again. So, just to wrap up everything that's been discussed, the idea of multidisciplinarity, which is so important to animal studies. As you know, this is one of the main strengths of animal studies. There's been pride in animal studies, perhaps like nowhere else, on the grounds of its multidisciplinarity. Yet, as I explained earlier, this comes with complications, especially when conferencing. You're in front of an audience that does not know exactly your subject, but also it comes with a conflict that is within practice itself. As an art historian, I feel the duty to be true to history of art and visual cultures and its methodologies, as well as I have to be true to animal studies. That's where the internal clash happens. They're not necessarily going along hand in hand, as I tried to show today. So, a negative term. What do I mean by this? Just like to close with a little warning based on my experience of conferencing most recently. So, instances of humanities scholars being heckled at conferences. What do I mean by this? Well, this is one elephant that nobody addresses when it could be addressed, which is within the room, that everyone talks about afterwards. Did you see that? Did you hear that? How could they let them say that? why did you not say anything, right? And I say that for myself too. Sometimes I was just there, sitting on the chair, going like, that's wrong. Why are we letting that happen, right? And there's something important here. The idea that I get a sense right now that contemporary art, along with other philosophical thinking tools, if you like, and humanities more in general, are being seen by certain circles as non-active and non-essential because they don't embrace activism and they don't embrace a physical bridge with the outside world. So questions exclusively focusing on an animal rights agenda preclude the opportunity to think beyond anthropomorphism and reduce the possibility for original thinking in animal studies. I've been at conferences over and over again where a paper has been presented which clearly works on some complex philosophical grounds, and then we receive questions from the audience based on animal rights stands. And then you have to wonder, these are two different agendas that can come together to produce something, but if you bring them along just to create clash and to accuse and point the finger at a non-activist and therefore useless framework, then we're not going anywhere with this. And the animals are still out there in the meantime, right? So, colleagues disrespect subject-specific frameworks is exactly what I think I'm preoccupied right now. I feel that if I stand at a conference and work and talk about contemporary art, some of the audience will be sitting there thinking, yeah, ugly pictures and nothing's being done at the same time. Philosophy, pretty words or words I don't understand, but they don't change anything out there. But the point is that no action comes from non-thinking. So my invitation is to go to conferences and respect everyone's colleague, framework, and subject, and really try to think before any activism can take place. Being interested in contemporary art or being interested in philosophy or being a historian or working in geography doesn't mean necessarily that what you're saying doesn't result into a change out there. So, non-activist, non-animal rights, non-vegan perspectives seem to be dismissed and at times not tolerated. And I think this is the biggest elephant in the room that needs to come out. So if you go to a conference after my talk today and you notice this and you think there's nothing productive coming out of a confrontation between the different animal studies quarters, then you might want to say something. I will definitely say something because I wonder if the divisiveness pervading animal studies can be at all productive right now. So my invitation is to keep an open mind and carry on. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. You certainly made me ask a lot of questions, or a lot of questions were circulating through my head that I would like to ask you, but I give the first questions, and there is the first question I'd like to give you.
Thank you for bringing so many diverse topics together in this kind of organized way. I wonder if your intention was to produce the kind of effect that the whole talk had on me, which is to get much more negative about the history of art. Should I now worry more about what's been done, terrible things done to animals in the history of art? Is this how I should now look at the history of art? And, I know from working with a lot of scientists, like many scientists I've talked to say that they decide to work on insect sounds and communication instead of other animals, because nobody cares if you're absolutely nobody. No activist ever comes into biology. And are we now supposed to think, gee, we have to get angry at this butterfly? We have to get angry about things that right now, I don't know if this people in this room, but in general, most people concerned about animals are not so worried about the use of insects, either in science or art or pigments and most people love cool things made out of dead butterflies and don't worry about them so much. Should we get more worried and thereby be more critical, more negative, and use animal studies to get even more negative about the history of art?
Well, great question there to start off. Nice to know that I've just completely ruined the PR of classical art in the process for everybody. Well, you know, if that's how you feel about it, that's also fine. But I hope that the talk just made people aware of the contradictions that are present everywhere, and that therefore, yes, maybe, you know, it's good to walk through the National Gallery in London and perhaps spare a thought about those animals that were killed. It doesn't bring them back, but at the same time, it makes you aware. It bursts the bubble that there was a dream world where everything was sweet, and where animals didn't die, and beauty was being made that way. Whichever way you want to take that awareness, I think the awareness is the main point that I wanted to bring to the table today, because I got tired of seeing people pointing at contemporary art relentlessly and nobody raising a stick at classical art. And I'm totally with you with the same idea of the death of insects being irrelevant still. So that's where Damien Hirst, I think, wedges himself really smartly, because of course the shark tends to upset more people, but yet again the shark comes from Australia, and in Australia, as we know, sharks are being culled all the time because they're perceived as pests. He chooses his insects and his animals very carefully, and I think the idea was, all in all, with the talk, to create awareness so that perhaps we can move on. I'm aware of the fact that it may have soured classical painting in the process, but if that's the price to pay to move on, maybe there's no other way around it, right? And we'll see.
Thank you very much. It was very interesting to hear all those facts about the use of animals as material, part of material art, which I think is one part of a long, very long tradition of using every part of an animal, if you store it.
Absolutely.
For something, for a bow or whatever, shoes. And but I was wondering if the main thing that horrifies people, like with the Damien Hirst piece, like the shark, instead of the oil and canvas thing when you see it, is that the animal is not about the use of the animal as such, but more, well, the exposure, the presentation, which is kind of something unethical.
Yes, I think that is an issue that goes beyond history of art. You know, I talk about history of art because I'm an art historian, but we are visual animals as much as philosophers like to say that we are animals of words, right? The idea is that we respond to images in a way that sometimes it's impossible to break down in a kind of sensible amount of time. And seeing something or hearing about something is a completely different thing. The essence of what you learn is different. So you can translate, there are so many examples in the history of art. Think about Guernica by Picasso, for instance, the mural painting he made in response of the bombing of the town that Hitler, Franco, and Mussolini organized. He wanted to create a picture for something that didn't have a picture, that communicated the violence and the pain that was being felt by the people who were killed in that occasion. And the image traveled around the world as a statement against violence and war. It had a different impact, if you like, than text that you could have read about the event. So we do respond to visuality in different ways, and sometimes visuality takes the upper hand, whereby we are definitely emotionally triggered in a different way. Yet again, my point is, if you want to take a serious and believable ethical stance in contemporary art against the killing or suffering of animals, then you can't turn a blind eye to animals that are turned into materials. Like now, as I said, there are so many animals going into contemporary pigments, and nobody's raising any issue with those. So there's plenty of pig, once again, in contemporary paint. I wonder how many artists check their tubes before they buy them to see if there is or there isn't any animal in it. So these are things that we should be aware of if we want to move on. I think perhaps the point is that by ruining classical art for everybody, the point is that we may appreciate the contradictions and just learn to embrace them, which doesn't mean necessarily that we just have to kill them all and put them into jars for us to paint with. But it might open up our awareness to the fact that things are much more complex as they might seem, and it's not academically viable to just continuously focus on the visibility of a shark in a tank when there are all these other issues related to it.
Giovanni, thank you very much for this inspiring talk. Actually inspires me as a musicologist to think about a quite similar situation in music. But I'm not sure that I dare to say this because I will ruin your image of classical music as well. I mean, we as physicians are talking about the representations of animal sounds and animal melodies, like in the music of Vivaldi or Mozart. But actually we use lots of animal materials for musical instruments as well. We use the skins for the drums, we use the horse's hair for the bows of the string instruments, and leather and ivory for the piano. And there is such a undercurrent of animal use or misuse in music as well. And I think also no one has thought about that before we brought up the point in music. Thank you.
My pleasure to have ruined classical instruments for you too. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you for especially all the numbers and statistics. I feel like I learned a lot. I just want to close a gap. I'm not aware of how to kill a butterfly without destroying it. So I was wondering if you can.
There are many ways that have been experimented with over time. Marissa Villamarian used to, she wrote a passage in this diary which she explains how you need to warm up a needle over a candle, over a flame, and then you hold the butterfly down, it's of course alive, so you kind of like push it down and just push the needle right through the thorax. That kills the butterfly immediately, because what you want to avoid is the fluttering, because as the butterfly flutters and tries to get free from you, the more it does so, the more it deteriorates the pattern on its own wings. So you want to do it quickly. She does say in her diary that way it dies quickly, which, again, the ethical stand to that, it's yours, and you can all find it, we can all find it individually, whether that's acceptable or not. But things have moved on, and they have moved on not so much because of compassion, but because there has been realization that the needle actually still ruins the insect. And right now, if you look at the way butterflies are graded in the industry, in the official industry of butterfly trading, you don't want any ruination whatsoever. So the butterfly is allowed to come out of the cocoon, or the chrysalis, it's allowed to stretch its wings, and when that is done, it's usually killed using gassing, because you don't want any contact whatsoever with human hands. You would really limit it. So there are many ways. Yeah.
And was there someone behind you actually? Did you? No, then it's the young woman.
Yeah, thank you very much. That was a great talk. I'm an ethicist, so I'd like to come back to your idea that you presented all this in some way that, as I understand it, so we can move on. So I would like to know what does moving on mean? One thing I understood from your talk is that it can't simply mean that we get rid of the question if animal cruelty was involved, because actually it means just that we have to add all the cruelty of the invisible animals. So it's still the question if there's animal cruelty involved here. But another thing I understood from your talk is that we might want to see if the artwork really makes people ask questions. And I had the impression that this is one problem you have with the butterfly picture, that people were standing there just telling, oh, it's like butterflies. So you seem to be upset with that. Is it because people didn't ask questions and didn't make people think?
Okay, great. So let's go up to the first point, how to move forward, right? The moving forward is what I seem to have been kind of achieving, like by making you dislike animal presence that's been rendered in your own disciplines and that perhaps you had not yet considered. The idea is that I think a true ethicality in animal studies must consider representation just as much as animal materials going into the making of objects, right? We can't talk about one and ignore the other altogether. So the moving forward, it's up in the hands of anyone's discipline and anyone's ethicality within that discipline. So in my case, in writing about works of contemporary art, I will try to make sure I balance the two if I feel that it's where I want to go instead of ignoring the material side of things. The idea is not that of condoning animal cruelty or animal killing in any by any stretch of the imagination, but it's to be aware of it. So it kind of like pushes the bar higher in terms of the game that we're playing. It's not just about accusing, but it's about thinking. And by considering the materiality of things, of objects, we do something that is very animal studies, or that used to be very animal studies 10 years ago, 15 years ago, when animal studies was based around really thinking networks. So when I become suspicious about the content of animal matter in a painting, what I do is that I move beyond the object itself and I track down the networks of animal and human histories that made that animal turn into an object. So you will look at markets, you will look at why that animal was there in the first place, why the artist used it, right? So it takes you back in history, or it takes you back geographically to look at areas and understand why this happens. The moment you understand why that happens, that's how you can change it, right? So that's how I mean moving forward. Not stop at the object. It's like, oh, that cow, that's despicable. And that's all we can say about it. That's not animal studies, you know? Animal studies always implied an analysis of network, a revision of ontology, and a reappraisal of history. So where history was always written with us in the forefront, writing histories about ourselves, animal studies proposed histories in which animals are equally present. Of course, they might be subjugated in most histories, but giving them the relevance that they play back makes a different history come to light. So there are many ways in which disciplinary you can take that way forward, and I can't quite say what those would be in each discipline, but I definitely think I know where it can be taken when it comes to contemporary art. Then there was the second part of your question, which was the one about butterflies. I was upset because of so many things with those butterfly paintings, but like I said, a work of contemporary art that makes you upset, it's a good work of contemporary art, because being upset, it's exactly the same as what happened to people in front of Olympia back in those days. And then you have to ask yourself, why are you upset? So that's what I did, and that's why I went back to the work over and over and over. I'm upset because I don't like the idea that all those butterflies are being killed, right? So initially, I was caught up in this sublime. That's when I wrote my paper called On a Wing and a Prayer. I questioned the idea of sublime and how sublime is being manipulated by Damien Hirst to make us go, wow. Now, with Damien Hirst, it's difficult to understand whether he wants you to go beyond that wow or not. But that's part of the artist he is. He's a pop artist. Like Andy Warhol, did he want you to think beyond the factuality of the work? The shock value of the electric chairs? There are essays and books written about those works, so people certainly felt triggered to go beyond. Maybe not everyone did in the first instance, but that's where allowing time to think about contemporary art is the main thing. One of the things I always tell my students that's very important to understand contemporary art and not to hate it right away, because sometimes that's the response, is that classical art and contemporary art work in opposite ways. So with classical art, you read about what you will see before you go to see it. Whenever you're in a classical art museum, you look around you and you will see things that you learned at school. Crucifixions, wars, you feel good because you recognize everything you see. So you feel smart, you feel in an environment where what you knew was important is being reassessed. Contemporary art expects of you the opposite. You look at the work, you're puzzled, you feel the ground coming away from your feet, and you have to go home and start the research. You have to look at these works in books, on your computer, on the internet, on the artist's website, and try to make sense of them. That's how I ended up knowing about the butterfly trade. So it's important to know that, and again, I can't expect everyone who comes from different disciplines to know that, but usually who works with contemporary art knows that the work never stops upon encountering the work and upon just leaving the gallery space. A good work of contemporary art stays with you for days and days, and it haunts you and it wants you to look for more to unbreak and undo. So I was upset about the deaths of butterflies. Of course, nobody likes to think about butterflies being killed for the purpose of making a beautiful picture, yet I was caught up in looking at this thing and thinking, my God, it's beautiful. It made me think about all the cruelty and all the death that occurs in human history. Think about Gothic cathedrals, right? We all walk through them, walk through Notre Dame, go like, whoa, it's uplifting, it's amazing. There was no worse perpetrator of death than the church around that time. So when we walk through those Gothic cathedrals, we look around and all we really see is death. And also there's this notion that not many people are likely to embrace readily, but for every Gothic cathedral there is a forest that's being raised because of the scaffolding that was needed to build this massive building. So again, the questions to me when it comes to animal studies are never about looking at the object and critically, aesthetically addressing what we see, but it's about the networks hidden behind. It's about excavating. And it's not easy, and it's not about coming out with definite answers that are yes and no, black and white. I don't believe in that. I know some people do, some scholars do, and that's where part of the clashes exist. But I think it's important to embrace these clashes rather than just kind of draw big X's on entire subjects, which is what I've seen most readily. I've been at conferences where people would say, yeah, the philosophy is not the way to go about animals. Okay, let's see, what else can we do? You're taking out the whole of philosophy from animal studies. What's left?
There are two more questions, but I take the privilege now of having the chair here, and it's actually kind of a follow-up question to a talk that perhaps could have been called the butterfly in the room instead of the it's another butterfly question, and what you said when you showed the picture of the Damien Hirst butterfly object. You said, you were upset by this, but in a different way than in the trays with the butterflies. Mm-hmm. And maybe I misread you, but my impression was that you find the tray more upsetting than the Damien Hirst.
Yes.
But why? What's the difference? Why do we privilege the artist in killing I don't know how many thousands of butterflies for making us ask questions that literature, for instance, could ask without killing actual animals? And why is the fact that the tray uses the same method as the artist not asking the same question? So where would you draw the line? And
sure.
What's the difference? Actually?
Well, there are many differences there. First of all, the point about literature and the idea that literature could make us understand the same point. It might. I'm not quite sure what one would write to get the point across, but I think if it sinks, if that feeling upset or terror or disbelief sinks in upon seeing the butterfly paintings, if that really sets and it gets you to look for an answer, I feel personally that could be more powerful and more readily available in certain circumstances than perhaps having to engage in the reading of a text. Like I said, I was upset about the fact that most people would look up to them and then still not be upset about the deaths of butterflies. I wonder what would happen upon, passing over a text in which the whole process is described, if not even the real thing moves anything. That is really the real issue. Why doesn't the death of butterflies matter anymore to anybody? And I've got an answer for it in my paper. But the idea of the tray upsets me the most, and it goes back to your question, because there's no idea there. With Damien Hirst, at least, I can say, well, out of all this killing of butterfly and this display, I've been pushed to think about broader issues of animal cruelty and human cruelty that took place in Western culture and went again undetected. Whilst when I look at those trays, I don't think. I just think, what a shame. There's no conceptual attachment to those trays. They're just souvenirs that have been made to circulate around very cheaply, made with butterflies that have been killed illegally. So there I see quite a discrepancy, and definitely the lack of the idea, the fact that this killing seems to really have been happening for no reason whatsoever but to please somebody's aesthetic value, when you could have had rose petals, or you could have had feathers that just fell off birds, or anything else. Didn't quite need to go all the way to use butterflies.
I'm still not convinced, because I think it's still privileging one form of using the animal over another. Mm-hmm. If you put put that tray in, it's a question of framing.
I'm accepting the contradiction.
If you're putting the tray in a gallery space, Man Ray like,
sure.
Then suddenly
absolutely.
So it's all in the eye of the viewer again. Anyway, I think this is something that probably we want to keep.
I think it's important. It's the idea of the what I'm trying to say with this talk is that there's no answer. We have to somehow trying to embrace the paradox and the clashes that are part of everyday life. There is a demand for these butterflies, whether we like it or not, and that is the real issue.
Yeah. It raises an interesting question about art, actually, also, the function of art. But there's another.
You brought it up several things, Giovanni. I was just going to try for myself, very selfishly, to sort of like summarize a little bit in a slightly different way what you maybe were presenting for us. And one or three things that I could come up with would be one, that you're encouraging an analysis of contemporary art that basically is based in an analysis of social relations and production. That's why the Schuking book becomes a point of reference. Second, you're using it and emphasizing very strongly this idea of contemporary art. And I was very intrigued because the modern art that then pops up here and there, is becomes sort of the beginning of the contemporary. But you, at the same time, did not emphasize this aspect that might be an inheritance of contemporary art from, modern art or avant-garde, maybe we could say avant-garde, that is the rethinking of the meaning of art. So with every one of these works, we have a displacement of the so-called object of art, or of an object from its canonical placement, right, position. The taxidermy, object that we see in the Museum of Natural History, and we don't question that much. But once we see it within, right, the institution of art, à la Duchamp, right, so then we are forced to question the boundaries of the discipline itself, right, of the field. So then the question returns to be, even for post-aesthetic art, a question of aesthetics, a question of discrimination, which you very pointedly brought up at the very beginning of your talk, when you actually said, we can't use the paper in English or the action, right, the installation, whatever it is, of the student. That is not art. Okay? So the issues returns to be, even in matters of responsibility, of commitment, of whatever, right? A question of social relations of production, and a question of the definitions of the aesthetic or post-aesthetic world in which we live today. And that's why I find it particularly interesting taxidermy, in fact, right? So this shifting of knowledge, taxidermy as the producer or the means of production of knowledge in the science, context, but at the same time, just the producer of death when it is, in the institution of art. So that I find very intriguing, and that is where the contradictions emerge very strongly.
Yeah, so that's part of your example. I think it's very fitting. If the tray went into a gallery, that suddenly would become much more problematic in a way that would perhaps trigger some other buttons, but nonetheless, I think it's important that Damien Hirst sources his butterflies ethically, and when I say that, of course, it means a lot, rather than harvesting them from the wild. I think right now with animal studies we have a slight issue with regards to not really paying much attention to ecosystems and the implications of human-animal relations and ecosystems, and that's why there's a fragmentation of animal studies into fields that are looking at broader implications and broader networks, which is where animal studies might go at some point.
And then there's the question of the spectacle, because as I understood it, is the disappointment that you felt in front of the Damien Hirst butterfly. It's not the same disappointment, it's not just the disappointment about the death of the animal, but it's actually the disappointment at the unacknowledged effect, or not intent, but effect of the work of art, which is critique. So if critique, rather than knowledge, is what art, contemporary and modern art produced, in that case, we are falling back into the fetish and not into the recognition of labor, for example.
Yes, and that is part of the challenge itself. I think that's what's been very difficult to tease out from art and history of art itself. You think about Baxandal, for instance, and I think in contemporary art there's definitely an issue of that kind, where the fetish is what we seem to fall back because of psychoanalysis and because of Marx, and balancing the two always becomes a problem. Right? That's why I think that with animals we have a different responsibility level that we might want to think about carefully.
I think we have time for one more question, right? Or more? Okay.
Thanks for your talk. Very important issue raised. My comment became a little bit redundant because of Cecilia's commentary. But maybe I can add a little bit. In terms of the hypocrisy and the I agree with the hypocrisy in animal studies in terms of contemporary art, but that points exactly to the question of the role we allow contemporary art or art in general to play in our lives and to challenge us, and that is exactly the point about the critique, and then we fall back into the fetish and then we just sort of engage with the art from a safe distance, even if we're close to it. Still, ideologically, we're at a safe distance from it. That animal studies should exactly sort of point to that issue and engage with that issue and question, well, what role do we want to give to contemporary art, and in what way can that initiate a very and probably incredibly powerful critique of human-animal relationships? And it's not so much a question necessarily of the material that went into the artwork, but how does the artwork challenge us? And the big criticism about contemporary art in that respect probably points to a particular quality actually of these works, and especially first Sharp. And I thought that your comment on the Sharp way towards the shark from in the Australian context shows that particularly. It's very important that it's a shark and not an animal.
Absolutely. It's a pretty complicated matter, I think, with regards to what this might lead to. As I said, I'm not 100% sure. I think I really would love people to take it where they like individually, depending on where they come from in art. Some art historians would utterly disagree with my perspective. I feel that there's a sort of imperative to really pay attention to it. There's also something fascinating about how, in a way, paint and classical painting share a completely different relationship here. And like you, Cecilia, brought back Duchamp and the idea that Duchamp changed so much in the idea of art itself, and how, to me, it starts with Duchamp and the ready-made, how the real urinal made of ceramic comes into the gallery space, and suddenly that's also gone a little bit undetected in the history of art. That's a major shift. Not just the fact that the urinal is not being made by artists, the fact that this object comes in with a new material within a context. I mean, ceramic had been used in art, but more in craft, if you like, than art with a capital A. So there is all this history of materials that runs through modern art that's kind of being unacknowledged to a degree, and contemporary art is perhaps still not raising to that challenge, but there's certainly something happening. And I think animal studies could definitely bring something to history of art or visual cultures in that respect. And I think that is becoming part of the problem right now. I'm slightly afraid that animal studies is not winning over other subjects per se. So there are plenty of scholars building that bridge, but when you're in a broader arena, so for instance, I talk about an art historian, myself, working with animals, whenever I encounter colleagues in discipline in history of art, it takes a while until they really understand what it is that we're trying to do with it. And they always think that you're writing about cute animals and otherwise why bother. And there is a sense that animals in art has not been yet incorporated in history of art. I did this review for a book that will come out later on, and I looked at every single history of art review book that's been published over the past 20 years. And I'm talking about those big volumes that cover the whole of the history of art. They're still being published. And also visual culture readers. And I checked absolutely everything to find a trace of animals in art, postmodern animals, and nothing, absolutely nothing whatsoever has yet trickled through from what we've done over the past 15, 20 years into the Bibles of history of art. So I'm drawing a parallel here between feminism and gender studies, and if I open one of those history of art Bibles and I look through, there are chapters and chapters of feminist art during the 60s and the 70s, and of course those artworks are seminal. There will be Damien Hirst and the shark, and there will be the butterfly paintings, but none of these history of art Bibles address them from an animal studies perspective. They just talk about them from an aesthetic perspective. And that's where it ends. I think that is a big elephant that I found a little bit too specialistic to bring in today. That's another elephant that needs to be, ushered out gently. Why hasn't this discussion of animal studies and art trickled into the broader, or not even trickled in, but found a firmer, because it probably has trickled in, but it hasn't found a firmer and deserved place in history of art more broadly yet. I think it's quite worrying. What is the resistance there from the subject of history of art and visual cultures, even? History of art, I can kind of understand why there'd be resistance. Visual cultures, I'm really lost. But all the big readers of visual cultures that have been published recently, no animals to be found.
Just a very short reply to that. It may be even the most important element, actually. Maybe more important than the elements, even though it is very specialist, or it appears very specialist, but I think it might be the most important one, the one that might show the most results, the biggest results. Especially because it relates to, on the negative side, on the naivety towards art and animals, on both the animal study side and the general art historians.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And I think because those books are usually the ones read by students, those are the books that usually are featured in reading lists for year one, I think it sets the students to immediately think, okay, the main reading or the most authoritative reading on Damien Hirst's shark is the one that doesn't care about the death of the shark, or doesn't acknowledge it to start with, or that doesn't acknowledge the problematic of this new presence in contemporary art. And then you have to fish out, no pun intended, the students, right? And sort of try to convert them, right? And then, no, look, there's also this other thing going on, and you should really ponder your views more carefully. Whilst I don't feel that when it comes to gender studies, students have to do that anymore, right? But we've been around for a long while now talking about animals in art, so I feel it's about time that happened.
Okay, I think it's time now to relocate the discussion to where the food is as well.
Nice.
Thank you again. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.